everyone. I'm really pleased that there are lots of familiar faces, but I'm also delighted that there are some people I have not met before, so welcome in. Okay, well, while people are settling down, I'm going to get started just to keep us a little bit on time. First of all, as those of you who look around this room recognize, this is a real team effort. There are people who really help, and we are so grateful to all the volunteers and to all of our partners here. Pet Lakes Association, the Putnam Department of Health and Soil and Water Conservation, obviously New York State Federation of Lake Associations. We have a treat a little bit later. We do have the executive director here, and we have several board members here as well. We could not visit this beautiful facility without the kind contributions, really, a donation of this space by the Sedgwick Club. And all of the IT, the fact that you can now hear me with a mic, is all due to Cornell Cooperative Extension, who also helps organize all the slides, has brought this magnificent display and the microphones. So, let me get started. So while I have said there's a cadre of people that are helping to get the food ready and helping us pack and helping us set up and will help clean up, I want to say especially these people who are helping us today. So we've got one restroom upstairs, but that's probably better for people who have difficulty with stairs, and there's more facilities available downstairs. If you have any questions about where, let me know, I can tell you, but it's basically down a hallway downstairs. We're going to try to keep everything on time, which is a little ironic because I started a few minutes late, but everybody else will do better than me. Okay, lunch. We have, our speakers have generously agreed to stay for lunch and be available for questions, but also it's a great time to talk with people from other lakes who might have similar problems or issues or concerns or solutions that you have. We do have a recycling container. This is sort of an echoey room, so if you want to have a private discussion with someone during the session, please take it downstairs. Thanks to Neil, we've got the presentations that will be videotaped, and I hope to put them up on the nice full website so everyone can see them. And they also were on the Putnam County website for people to take a look at. And we now sort of say this more routinely than we used to, but if you don't feel well, please go home. Nothing personal, but leave. Okay. I wanted to mention, because this is a nice full sponsored conference, that we do have some nice full of resources. There is an annual statewide conference. The one just happened in May. We'll have one again in May of next year. There are regional meetings throughout the state. The website has a lot of information on it. There's also a Facebook page you can get on. Dave Carr will be coming up later. He's our executive director. Nancy Muller, many of you might know from CSLAP. She's now full-time CSLAP coordinator, which I think really brings attention to this important program. And Dave will talk a little bit more about this, but the organization is about to kick off a strategic plan. So if you have ever wanted a statewide lake association to do something, let us know. Now's the time to help us figure out where we're going in the future. Okay, and the people from Sedgwick, I talked about we have a very strong partnership with people. Asked me to talk a little bit about this. I don't know a lot, but there will be a talk with the author of Taking Our Water for the City in September. It will be here. The book itself features how China Pond and also Boyd's Corner Reservoir got created. Okay, this is a little bit outdated, but you can see that Putnam, most of you are from Putnam. There are people from Westchester, Dutchess, other places. We have Lake Association members. We have representatives from 21 sea-slap lakes, and I'll mention that. I might not have told you exactly what that is. Tax district members, municipal boards, council members, state and local officials. I know there are some people from the Putnam County Legislature here. And we really want to thank the professionals who deal with lakes and lake issues for being here too. So, I'm a minute late. Okay, so the agenda. We're going to start with Scott, talking about sort of how to quantify how much effort to put into figuring out what's going on with your lake. Chris is going to talk about some of the technologies and their pluses and minuses. Then we're going to have a little bit of a break. Then Dave Carl will get up and talk, so you'll have a chance to see him. Also, I'll try to make sure anyone who wants to meet him meets him at break as well. Then Elena Onion from DEC is also going to talk about wetland disturbance. That's not the topic, that's not the exact title of her talk. I've used some editor's license to get these things in here.
I like it, Jan.
You like it? Okay. And then AJ is going to talk, who many of you might have seen from last year, and he's one of the lake managers around here, is going to talk about really an experiment that he did on passive phosphorus uptake. So, and then we'll have lunch for networking and roundtables. So without further ado, I'm going to start my introduction of Scott.
Can you just get people to turn off their cell phones?
Get people to turn off their cell phones. Okay. So a request from the audience, but a smart thing to do. I apologize, I didn't think of it. So I'm so delighted that Scott's here. We've tried to get him here in the past, and finally he's agreed to come. He's one of my heroes. I first met him when I started sampling lakes in 2004. And while Scott's too modest to mention it, he was really the driving force behind the implementation of a statewide lake monitoring program that used volunteers. Some of us might remember, back in the 1980s, it was a real battle to get officials to accept that work done by people like you and me, who aren't professional scientists, is valued. And Scott got the state to really endorse the CSLAP program, Citizen Statewide Lake Management Assessment Program. And that partnership with NYSFOLA is really what got the whole organization growing. The program that began with 25 lakes now serves over 180. So Scott retired, but he, so he didn't really retire from worrying about lakes, but he also became the chief caretaker of a grandchild. So that will explain the introduction that he sent me to use, which is Scott Kishbaugh used to be the chief of NYSDEC Lake Monitoring and Assessment Section. He was the first and longtime director of CSLAP for 33 years. He used to be one of the founders of the Northeast Aquatic Plant Management Society and the State Aquatic Invasive Species Coordinator before PRISMS, and before the governor's AIS task force. He used to be the creator and manager of the state HABS program, and he used to be the senior author of both editions of Dial for a Small Lake. But he retired. He now is PPOP. So with that, help me to welcome Scott.
Too kind. I'm not the chief caretaker of my two grandchildren. My wife and I are the caretakers. A couple months ago, Jan reached out to me and asked if I'd be willing to come out of retirement and give a talk. And explicitly, she said, "You can talk about whatever you want." I've known Jan for more than 20 years now. I've never seen such a huge error in judgment. So I agreed to talk about how much, but really, as you'll see, this talk is how much Scott can we take? I hope about 45 minutes, but I guess we'll find out. If you're going to ask how much, or I'm going to ask you to ask how much, I'll ask you to ask a different question. Why? Why monitor? The list here are lots and lots of reasons why someone may be involved in monitoring. For any particular person, for any particular lake, for any particular problem, one or more of these may apply. But you always have to ask why before you ask how much, because you're not going to be able to answer how much without answering the question of why. And that can include assessing lake conditions, determining trends, identifying problems, gathering data, blah, 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 blah. All of those whys are important. And as Jan talked about a little bit, and I emphasize for 40 years, and I'll do it again 5 years into retirement, it's the power of volunteers. A lot of those whys, a lot of the reasons why you are monitoring, sampling, surveying, doing surveillance, can be done by volunteers, and in fact should be done by volunteers. So there's lots of reasons, just like there's lots of reasons why to sample, there's lots of reasons why volunteers are so important. I'm going to highlight the ones in red. Jan talked briefly about the CSLAC program, Citizen Statewide Lake Assessment Program. 180 lakes. Elena Onion is now the coordinator of the program. Raise your hand, Elena. You'll hear more from her later. Why volunteers are so important? In red, they live on the lake. They're responsive to immediate and short-term changes. So in the CSLAC program, one of the things that the volunteers do, and there's many of them here in the room, is fill out a perception survey every time you go out and sample. We ask you, what do you think about the condition of the lake? So when I go out, or went out, Elena goes out, when AJ goes out, when Chris goes out, when professionals go out, our frame of reference is very different. So if you live in a lake that has a typical water clarity reading of 1 meter, and it goes up to 2 meters, my God, that's great. But if we come out and sample, we've seen lots of lakes, 2 meters, that might not be so good. That change is important. Likewise, if you live on Lake Placid, where the typical water clarity reading is like 9 meters, and it drops down to 7, that's a problem. Where if we went out and sampled 7, my God, that's great. That distinction, knowing what's normal in your lake, is really important. So you can identify changes in conditions, you can locate HABs, you can detect new AIS. All of those things are important, and I'll come back again and again to the idea that volunteers play a critically important role. So, whether it's volunteers or professionals that are doing their sampling, I can encapsulate this whole talk in one slide. You can never, ever, ever, ever conduct enough monitoring. You always are going to increase your confidence in what you're trying to learn from the data when you have more data. Particularly because you can elect to choose only part of that data, but having all of that information in hand can make an enormous difference. But it's not that simple to just say, go out and collect more data, because that process of collecting information comes with a cost. There's a cost of analyzing samples, the cost of your time, the cost of laboratory resources, and really the cost of expectations. You have all this information, what are you going to do with all that? So All those things need to be kept in mind. The next 42 minutes, whatever I'm left with, is going to focus on 3 particular areas: aquatic plants that I've spent a fair amount of time, even in retirement, working on, and 2 areas where my knowledge is, I'll say, is more archaic: water quality and HABs monitoring. I'll talk about all 3 of those areas. So first, talking about aquatic plant surveys, the survey in the first slide. Here are 4 examples of lakes, all in the lower Hudson region, for which aquatic plant monitoring has been done. Each of these had a different why, and as a result, they all had very different processes for trying to collect and gather information. So in the upper left is Creamery Pond, which is in Orange County, the first place in New York State where we found hydrilla. So DEC, me, went down and sampled, kind of ad hoc, because our goal was, how widespread is the hydrilla in the lake? So we dropped rakes in a bunch of different places. As you can see, not really systematic. Some points were pretty close to each other. Some were much further apart. But the goal is to get a rough understanding of how much is there. Upper right is Lake Wacabuck. I'll talk about Lake Wacabuck, Jan's Lake, in a few more time. But you can see the sampling points are much more consistently oriented along the shoreline, with the goal of understanding what are all the plants that are in the lake, and some other things that I'll talk about. Bottom right is Snyder's Lake in Rensselaer County, where we put a well-defined grid on top of the lake and sampled every one of those points that were in shallow enough water where plants were going to grow. And then on the left is Swartout Lake in Rockland County, where our goal was very different, that I'll talk about in just a few minutes. Except for the one on the bottom left, and most aquatic plant surveys, they're consistently looking at many sites but very few visits. What do I mean by that? Many sites mean if I'm standing in the middle of the lake, I'm really tall, but if I'm in the middle of the lake and sampling, and there's another point that's 50 feet away or 100 feet away, unless it's right on the shoreline, it's going to be really different than what you see here. Very different kinds of aquatic plants are growing. You need a lot of different sites to characterize the variability that would occur with the way aquatic plants grow. But if I'm sampling in the center of the lake and I come back a week later, it's going to be pretty much the same thing, at least as it relates to aquatic plants. Very many sites, very few visits. So the why. Why are you doing sampling? I'm going to talk about each one of these, or almost all of those, in a little bit more detail. But basically, many of the goals, the why you're doing aquatic plant surveying, is looking for specific plants, like hydrilla I talked about in Creamery Pond, finding all plants, what are all the plants that are growing in the lake, focusing just on all the aquatic invasive species, those bad plants that we're really concerned about, and so on. So each one of those whys is a very different protocol for collecting plants and dictate ultimately how much do you need to do. So let's start with the simplest one. The example again I gave of Swartout Lake. Back when I started 45 years ago, plants equaled invasive species equaled weeds. They were all thought of as kind of the same thing. The term invasive species really wasn't in the vernacular of most people who were concerned about lakes. It was only when you develop maps like you see on the upper left here, Eurasian water milfoil distribution around the state, that agencies, the state of New York, the federal government, started paying a lot more attention to invasive species. So to generate a map like this, you don't need to know, is there a lot of the plant in the lake or is there just a little bit? These are point maps that just tell you, is there that plant down in the lake? So in Swartout Lake, we knew that we were looking for Eurasian water milfoil as part of a water quality study. We went out to one point, found it, we're done. We don't need to look at aquatic plants anymore. That's not a typical aquatic plant survey, but it's one type of survey. So sampling can often stop when you get to that point. So the answer to the question, how much in that case, is once. One site, one time. Let's go all the way to the other side. If you're looking for all of the plants that are growing in the lake. Well, if you think about the way aquatic plants grow, an area that's about 1 foot in 1 foot area, 1 foot by 1 foot, an aquatic plant can grow in there, and it can grow in the next one, it can grow in the next one. If you're looking at a 25-acre lake, that's 1 million places, quite literally, 1 million places where aquatic plants are going to grow. I'm just guessing, you're not going to go out 1 million times and take a look at aquatic plants. So it's very unlikely that in that scenario, you're going to find every single plant that's growing in the lake. But what you can do is a method called subsampling. So I'm going to use Lake Wacabuck as an example, where they surveyed, let's just say 100 sites. It was actually 120 sites, but let's say 100 sites. How many are you likely to find in one site? Well, that's pretty easy. You count up, you average all of the plants that are found in each one of the 100 sites that you surveyed. That's what you would expect to see at one site. How about 2 sites? Well, you could average what you see in sites 1 and 2, and 1 and 3, and 1 and 4, and 17 and 39, and so on and so on and so on. The number of permutations are enormous. So what you do is subsampling. You evaluate what you would expect to see in 1 site, and 2 sites, and 3 sites, using some statistical methods, and then extrapolate that out to how many you might be finding at a much larger number of sites. Keep in mind that once you get beyond the 100 points that you get to, you can estimate how many more plants you're likely to find. You just don't know what those plants are. So there's some value to that, but there's some limitations to it. And keep in mind, you can only extrapolate that out so far. So within the area of the grid, that's a pretty accurate measurement for what's in there. Once you get beyond the grid, you're taking some guesses there. So let's take it down a notch. Instead of looking for what are all the plants, let's try to focus on whether you can find AIS at manageable levels. Where if you use a whole lake aquatic herbicide, it really doesn't matter. It's going to touch everything. But if your goal is to hand harvest all the plants, like they did with Brazilian LOD and Lake Wacabuck, about 1,000 square feet is realistically the most that could be managed. Well, how many 1,000 square foot areas are there in a lake? Well, in a lake that's about an acre in size, that's 400 different places. That's still a really intensive survey. So you can use the subsampling methods that I talked about to estimate how many plants are you likely to see at, in this case of Lake Wacabuck, 24,000 sites. Is that accurate? I don't know. Keep in mind also that once you get beyond a certain point, you have diminishing returns. So in a 40-acre lake, you would need about 15 sites to characterize lake conditions. I'll talk about how you get to that point in a couple of minutes. If you wanted to find 1 more plant, you'd probably need to get out to about 13 more sites. If you wanted to find 2 more plants, you'd have to go to 39 more sites, and so on. The number of sites that you would need to visit to get 1 more plant increases pretty dramatically. So there's limited return on what you're ultimately going to be able to find. So those are a couple of the considerations for thinking about how much sampling do you need to do. What I've been most interested in is how much sampling do you need to do to characterize a lake? Is the lake good? Is it bad? Is the floristic quality of the lake good, or is it bad? Well, there are a number of different ways that can be done, and I highlighted and read a couple of the methods that can be used to evaluate what is the condition, aquatic plant condition of the lake. You can look at whether invasive species are present or protected plants are present. You can look at the extent of surface coverage of plants. You can look at the change in the frequency or abundance of plants and so on. The best metrics, the best tools that are available use a combination of the quantity of the number of species of plants. If you have 20 plant species in the lake, presumably that's better than if you have 10 plant species in the lake. But it also looks at the quality of the plant. Is it native plants versus an exotic plant? So the best metrics, like a floristic quality index, can look at all of those things. But do keep in mind, you have to make sure you're comparing apples to apples. You want to make sure that if you're comparing 10 different lakes, they're all surveyed at about the same level of effort. And that effort is about 1 site for every 2 to 3 acres. That's the standard that the EC Corp required for many years. It's what the Adirondack Park Agency requires as part of its surveying. If you're going to do that, a couple of shortcuts that you can take. So if your goal is to say, in Putnam Lake in 2002, which has about 80 acres of growing area, this is the number of species that you would expect to see. It's on the order of about 11 to 11 and a half. If you only sample 15 different sites, you can actually construct some regressions that can give you a really accurate estimate of what you find at that site. In a larger lake, it takes about 25 sites. Finally, suppose your goal is to just say, I want to know what's in there, but I don't have a whole lot of time. Jan and other people from the Federation of Lake Associations developed this guide that's on DEC's website, on the Federation of Lake Association's website that says, if you don't have a lot of time and you're really just focusing on a couple plants, where should you look? What habitat should you look at? What water quality conditions should you be concerned about? What portions of the lake should you be looking at? So I encourage you to go for that, look at that guide if your goal is to say, how much sampling do we need to do? So, summarizing as it relates to aquatic plants, survey as many sites as you can. Getting back to the slide I showed in the very beginning, the best you're going to be able to do is to get to as many sites as possible, recognizing that there are limits, and that you have a limited return. And reasonable surveys are probably not going to get at all the points in the lake. So keep that in mind. For lakes that are less than 30 acres in size, if you sample 10 to 15 sites in the littoral zone, it's the area where plants grow, it's a reasonable estimate, and it gets you pretty close to what kind of survey effort is involved in a lot of other lakes. For larger lakes, survey one site for every 2 to 3 acres, and recognize that what I'm referring to is a truncated survey. 15 sites in a small lake, 25 sites in a large lake can be a reasonable estimate for quantity and quality, even though you might not be able to determine what all the actual plants are. It just tells you how many of them are there. So that's aquatic plant survey.
Can you go back to that last slide for a second, please?
Sure. Got it? Okay, next we'll go to water quality sampling. It's just the opposite of aquatic plant sampling. In aquatic plant sampling, I talked about how you need to look at a lot of sites, but you can do it at a very low frequency because it really doesn't change very much from 1 week to 1 month or so. Water quality sampling tends to be just the opposite. Far fewer sites, so again, if I'm in the center of the lake, I'm not standing anymore because I'm not that tall. The water quality in the center of the lake is pretty similar to what you have until you get to the extreme shoreline area. Most of the areas in the lake have very similar water quality characteristics, but they can change at a high frequency based on weather conditions, the time of year, and a whole bunch of other factors. So let's give a couple of examples. We talked about sea slap. Here's a lake that was involved in sea slap in its early years, Lake Lucille in Rockland County. This shows the change in water clarity measurements in the scale on the left between up to about 2.5 meters in depth, and how it changed over the course of the summer. So these were 15 samples that were collected, and you can see there was some variability in the beginning of the year, and then it was quite stable later on in the year. So that's sampling every week. What happens if you change that to sampling every other week? So that's the arrows in red show what the water clarity would have been like if those were the frequent interval sampling that you did every other week. So you'd see you catch some of the changes that occur in the beginning of the year, and of course you catch the stability that occurs at the end of the year. What about if we switch that to monthly sampling? Are we going to catch all of the variability? What happens if you only get out there once or twice? The National Lake Assessment, which is looking at water quality conditions in 1,000 lakes around the country, they go out one time in one location and compare those results over a 5-year period of time. So they'll go back 5 years later and sample the same lakes over and over again. When you're looking at it at that scale, basically 1,000 points distributed entirely around the country, you can tell something about water quality conditions, but not very much about the water quality in that particular lake. And what happens if you're in a lake where the variability is much more significant? The how much sampling can have a great impact on how you're ultimately trying to characterize that lake. So message number 2, every lake objective has its own answer to how much sampling, the why. And every answer has pros and cons associated with it. Again, there are costs, effort, actual resources associated with additional sampling. So, when possible, you should try to link your answer to the sampling objective. Some examples of sampling objectives, the questions questions that we ask in CSLAP and summarized at least historically in the reports is, what's the condition of the lake? Are the lake uses supported? Have the conditions changed? And how much change is needed to improve the lake? So what does that mean? Well, what's the condition of the lake? If you had to pick a number to characterize the lake, what would that number be? So, if your measurements tell you that your phosphorus measurement is 8, is that a good number? Is that a bad number? How certain are you that that 8 is not really a 12? Because you don't have enough confidence in the data. So more measurements give you more confidence, but again, at a cost. Are the lake uses supported? And I'll talk about that in a minute. Have the conditions changed? So if you sampled 10 years ago and your analysis suggested your value, the phosphorus value was an 8, and it's now a 12, that would suggest the lake's getting worse. But maybe 10 years ago it was actually a 12, and now it's an 8, and it's actually getting better. Again, more confidence with more data, but at a greater cost. And then how much change is needed to improve the lake? So we have, the state of New York has criteria that says if your phosphorus measurement is above X, it could represent a problem. So that's defined by lots and lots of years of historical data. Where your water body is right now is defined by sample. And again, more confidence comes with more data, but again, at a cost. So most of the evaluations that are done can be done in a couple ways. One is you can look at the average value, phosphorus concentration of 8. You can look at how frequently does it exceed a criteria. So, for example, if you're concerned about a toxic substance, you never want to see that above a criteria. So one time above the criteria represents a problem. For other things that are not health related, like recreation, a single exceedance might not be a problem. Maybe it occurred immediately after a storm. So you might need a greater number of exceedances to evaluate that criteria. How do you evaluate the criteria? Well, there's a bunch of numbers that can be used. One of the things that you see in the CSLAP report is trophic state. Is the lake oligotrophic, meaning it has low productivity? Is it eutrophic, meaning it has high productivity? And there are numbers associated with each one of those. Then there are state standards or criteria. You have the aesthetics criteria of 20 parts per billion for phosphorus. The health department says you can't put a new beach in unless your water clarity is more than 4 feet. And historical data found that if algae, chlorophyll A, is above 10, you have a much higher likelihood of getting harmful algal blooms. So those criteria, depending on how much sampling you're doing, can create some challenges. So if your criteria says you can't exceed your standard twice, if you sample once a week, that's 2 out of 15. That's about 14% violation. If you sample monthly, that's 2 out of 4. That's 50% of the time you're exceeding it. If you sample only twice and both of them are above the criteria, that's 100% of the time. If you're comparing it to averages, you get different results as well. So all of that can be important. How do you evaluate that? Well, when I showed the first slide about Lake Lucille, we used to sample in CSLAP every week. We did that for the first 4 or 5 years. So there were 61 lakes sampled over 162 years of time that were sampled weekly. You can look at all of those and say, well, how would your evaluation change based on weekly sample versus biweekly sample versus monthly sampling? So cutting to the chase, if you switch from weekly sampling to biweekly sampling, which is what we did in CSLAP back in 1990, again because resources were limited, we wanted to bring more lakes into the program, we lost an accuracy of the annual average by 13%. When you go from biweekly to monthly, you lose about another 20%. So there's a cost associated with it, but there's a gain in the resources associated with that. If your evaluation has said we don't want to exceed the criteria a certain number of times, you also see that there's some loss in accuracy when you move from weekly sampling to biweekly sampling to monthly sampling. That's particularly important if your lake has phosphorus and chlorophyll and water clarity readings that are close to those ranges. So I talked about the total phosphorus, the criteria being 20. If you're near 20, specifically if you're between 15 and 25, about half of the lakes may have an inaccurate measurement when you switch Why is that important? Well, about 40% of the lakes in the lower Hudson are in that range. So those are the kind of questions that should be asked each time you're trying to evaluate whether or not you need to do more sampling or less sampling. One of the things that you can take advantage of is the fact that a Secchi disc, the measurement that I showed on Lake Lucille, black and white disc that you lower over the side of the boat to see how clear the water is, that is a tremendous surrogate for phosphorus and chlorophyll. If you know what your clarity measurement is, you have a pretty good idea what your phosphorus measurement is, and you have a pretty good idea what your chlorophyll measurement is. So what you can do is say, maybe we're going to do monthly water quality sampling, but we're going to try to do a Secchi reading every week. That way you can see how those data can be compared to each other. So there's pros and cons to all those approaches, and that's what a water quality monitoring program has to evaluate. So what does that mean? Again, I'm going to reemphasize the question of the why. More data is better, no doubt about it. But more data comes with a cost, and that you can consider things like a Secchi disc to get the best of both worlds, where you have lots of high quality data that's supplemented with less frequent water chemistry measurement. If your goal is evaluating what is the condition of the lake, weekly is always better than bi-weekly, which is always better than monthly, but again, at a cost. If your objective is evaluating how frequently are you above that criteria, that's where the implications of less frequent sampling really become much more significant. So I'm going to close, I don't know how I'm doing on time. Okay. Moving quickly, because I do move quickly in this section, is harmful algal bloom monitoring, which is unfortunately the worst of both worlds. You need high frequency and many sites because these things change. A quick primer on water quality monitoring is most water quality indicators, phosphorus, have what's called a normal distribution. There's very few low points, very few high points, and most of them are right in the middle. That's really easy for characterizing water quality conditions. HABs are not that way. Specifically, algae is not that way. So we have a couple different plots here showing a couple different places. So think of it in four-dimensional space. Blow your mind. X, Y, and Z. So on the bottom left is Central Park Lake in New York City. The yellow showed the sampling points where HABs were occurring, and the other places where HABs were not particularly obvious. Owasco Lake, you can see streaks here out in the center, not in the center of the lake, but off the shoreline, but not along the shoreline itself. This plot shows a continuous monitoring that looks at the depth of the lake, so surface down to the bottom, and over time, and you can see in blue the places where blooms are occurring. Below the surface, middle of the summer. So what does that mean? If when you're doing your sampling, you're not at these points, but instead you're here, or you're over here, or you're up here, you're going to miss a bloom that may have been there already, and it just disappeared from sight. If you're in the Adirondacks, it's probably not a big deal. Blooms are pretty uncommon. But in this part of the state, blooms are much more common. The lower Hudson has seen a steady increase in harmful algal blooms, just like in New York State, but consistently higher than we've seen in the rest of the state. So this is an issue that's particularly important question.
Why do we believe there are fewer algae blooms in the Adirondacks than the lower in the state?
The simple answer is lower phosphorus concentrations. Nutrient levels have a significantly impact the frequency at which blooms are occurring.
So it's not climate?
Probably not, because many of the lakes up in that part of the state that have high phosphorus and nitrogen concentrations tend to have high blooms. So I'll answer some questions if we have time at the end. So in this part of the state, blooms are much more common. Blooms happen everywhere at any time for any duration, extent in depth, and can readily escape detection. That's great. How do you build out a monitoring program into it? Because they vary in 4 dimensions. Well, the way to do that, sampling is important. I spent the last 45 minutes probably now talking about the importance of sampling. But recognize for harmful algal bloom, sampling has real limitations. What the focus should be is on surveillance. Looking for what looks like a bloom. Green streaks, pea soup colors, looks like spilled paint, looks like green dots in the water. So What a lake community should do is be involved in two forms of remote surveillance and instantaneous surveillance. Remote surveillance is ask as many people who live along the shoreline to look for blooms and report that information back to a central repository. Instantaneous surveillance, if you're going to go out or your family is going to go out and swim, look to see what's going on right where you're going to be. If it looks like a bloom, don't go there, go someplace else. Surveillance is critically important and in the big picture probably far more important than sampling. Where to look? Downwind shorelines, calm days after a breezy day, and downwind shorelines at isolated coves. The blooms tend to rise up to the surface in calm or slightly windy days. They tend to push along to the shoreline, particularly isolated coves, and then they can't get out of the cove because the wind changes direction. There's a tree line that prevents the bloom from coming back out. So those are the places where you really want to look. Again, the power of volunteers, particularly as it relates to HABs, they can do far more than government agencies ultimately can do. There just is too much going on at too high a frequency, and you know it's normal in the lake. So, summarizing, sample as many sites as you can, but recognize that there's limitations to it. Tailor your actual survey protocol, the sites, the frequency, the locations, and the indicators for your monitoring objectives, the why you're out there. And consider strategies for optimizing your monitoring strategies if they support those objectives. That includes these, what I refer to as truncated surveys. 15 to 25 sites can give you almost all the information you need for aquatic plants. Using subsampling data and a standard frequency at which you're looking at sites, the use of water quality surrogates like water clarity, and focusing particularly on isolated coves and downwinds for HAB surveillance. Thank you for coming. Thank you for those of you who are volunteers. I can't specify it enough how critically important your work is, and thank you for your attention.
So we do have some time for questions, but I do want to say, so Tom has a remote mic so that everyone can hear the questions. So,
Scott, would you say something about the impaired lakes? Whose data makes a lake impaired? And if you're on the list, does anybody ever get off the list?
Well, let me start by saying, again, I've been retired for 5 years, so things could have changed pretty significantly. The impaired waters list, and if there are other people in the room here who have contradictory information, I welcome them to correct me. The impaired waters list is generated every 2 years by the state, or at least it has been generated every 2 years, based on criteria that the state establishes that says if a water body is exceeding these criteria, and every water quality indicator has its own sets of criteria. If they exceed those criteria, it is not meeting its designated use. That could be drinking water, it could be swimming, it could be fishing, it could be aquatic life. And if it isn't meeting those, it lands on the federal 303D list, which refers to a section of the Clean Water Act. That list is generated every 2 years from quality data. The data has to come from a program that has an approved quality control plan for monitoring and assessing the data, and at a laboratory that's been approved by the state of New York. CSLAP is one of those, but it's not the only one. There's other monitoring programs, including the state's own monitoring program that generates that information. Once a water body gets on the list, then depending on what it's on the list for, something called a TMDL might need to be developed, which is a calculation of how much removal of that pollutant is needed to get it in compliance again, and what are the steps to do that. Is it activities in the watershed? Is it things within the lake? Is it a combination of a bunch of things? And what is a timeline for getting that done? That process is very, very slow, and what often is done is the state works with communities in the interim to try to develop those measures. So among other things, the lakes that are on that list become a higher priority for funding programs and for a bunch of other activities. In terms of getting off the list, it's a very difficult process, but essentially it needs to be demonstrated that the water body is consistently now in compliance with the water quality standards. I realize that's a really bureaucratic answer, but I see Elena who might be able to.
So here's another bureaucrat. So I work for DEC. I coordinate the CSLAP program now, and I just want to add a couple points, if you don't mind. Since Scott's retirement, we're trying to be a lot more transparent about the assessment process. So in your CSLAP report, there's actually now a section that gives you the exact data that was used to develop that assessment. And I'm happy to walk you through. I've met with several lakes on Zoom to walk you through what that means and how the conclusions were made. I also want to take credit for the new changes in the sampling frequency for CSLAP. It's probably credit that is difficult for me to take because I'm sure not everyone's happy with it. Scott did a wonderful job giving a very Scott talk about the value of sampling frequency and the decisions the focus of our change was on answering the question, can we still detect the same level of change in each of your lakes using monthly sampling, and can we still detect whether or not this lake is meeting the human use? And so the conclusion in the vast majority of the lakes was yes. There are a few exceptions, and I just want to say that for those rare exceptions, we actually are willing to support additional sampling. So if you want to meet with me to walk through that analysis to understand how we came to that conclusion and whether or not your lake would be an exception, I'm very happy to meet with you and to try and walk through that process. So thanks, Scott, for letting me just say that.
Hi, Scott, good to see you, and thank you for that. The issue of sampling for checking for potentially harmful algal blooms or harmful algal blooms, it seems very confusing to me because, first of all, if we do it through CSLAP, we won't get the results for quite a while. If we do it privately, and I've never found a private place to sample to give an immediate response, in which case the bloom could well be past, it could be gone. So is there any accurate way in real time to assess an algal bloom and document it, or do we just have to presume that visually anything we see that could potentially be harmful is harmful and we should stay away from it?
It's a good question, and the short answer, and I know I'm incapable of giving you short answers, but the short answer is the presumption should be that if it fits any of those check boxes that I talked about, the spill paint, green, pea soup, green streaks, etc., that the presumption should be that that is a harmful algal bloom. That is what the state health department protocol is for their, at least it was 5 years ago, for their own swimming beaches, that if they saw that condition, they closed the beach down and didn't do sampling for another 24 hours before they would reopen the beach, and they would require a test result that indicated toxin levels below. The expectation is that the tools are improving. They continue to improve, but they're still not perfect, either because of the cost or the access to laboratories or other things. And that when you see those conditions, it is appropriate to say that that is a harmful algal bloom, and that if it turned out it was not, based on sampling that might take weeks or months to get, that is better to presume that it is and it isn't than to presume it isn't and it turned out to be. Does that make any sense at all? That visual surveillance is what the health department has relied on for years, and while it is still valuable to have water quality data that's associated with HABs for research purposes and to confirm blooms and all those other things, it still goes back to the presumption. If you see it, assume it is a harmful algal bloom. And I realize that's an uncomfortable answer in a lot of cases because it leads to uncomfortable decisions that need to be made. But the reality of it is the goal has to be to continue to protect people and exposed to this and can get quite sick in response to it. I have a feeling we're.
I just want all of us to thank Scott. That was a wonderful presentation. Scott will be doing a roundtable, and
No, actually, we're going to be leaving before lunch, but
okay.
grab me as a break and I'll be glad to-
So look for him at the break if you have questions that weren't answered. He's an enormous source of information and experience, and we are so fortunate to have him here, and so pleased that he joined us. And we're so pleased to have all of you here. I'm very pleased to present our next speaker. It's, I'm hesitating because I want to see if I get this. Chris Mikolajic. How'd I do?
You're good.
Okay. From now on, I'm going to call him Chris. But we're really pleased to have Chris here. He came a long way. He resides in Colorado now, but his roots are back in just this area. He grew up, I think, in New York State, in the Lower Hudson, and he attended a very special place for his first 2 years of college. Have people here heard of Paul Smith's College? Just to get a feeling. Yeah, it's a really special place. It's they name themselves as being the campus with 140,000 acres. The Adirondack Park is basically their campus, and at the time that Chris was there, it was particularly smaller than it is now, and I can't imagine what a wonderful experience. It certainly was a life-changing one for him. When he left Paul Smith's, he went to Rutgers, which is one of the premier ecological institutions in this country, and did his bachelor's and his master's from Rutgers. And then he's been working in the field since then, which is 25 years? 35. Oops. I'm making him younger than he is. He's 35 years. That's a lot of experience, a lot of lakes. And really, it is not, this experience is something that comes out of going through data after data, lake after lake, and really getting a feeling of it. I want to tell you that not only do I think we're very lucky to have Chris, he's extraordinarily well respected by his peers. He's been on, so we're a regional conference for the state Federation of Lake Associations. The national conference is called NAMS, North American Lake Managers Society, and Chris has been on their board for many years, and he's a recent past president of NAMS. So it gives you an idea of what his peers think of him. And I think you're going to hear a great talk. Thank you, Chris.
Thank you, Ray. So today I'm going to talk about tried and true technologies, or are they? There's going to be a lot here. I'm probably going to go pretty quick. This is the third time I've had to follow Scott. And I'm actually happy because I can toss about 6 to 8 of my slides after Scott talks, because they're going to be repeats of what Scott said. So real quick, we've already gone through this. This is the mother and wife slide. The only people that really care are my mother and my wife. So anyone who can solve the problems of water will be worthy of 2 Nobel Prizes. 1 for peace, 1 for science. All right? Can we all agree on that? Yeah. All right. That's where I live, by the way. So I threw this up here for a reason. Lake and watershed management. Symptom or cause? All right. And it's a bizarre picture for a lake presentation. 30 years ago, when my wife and I were dating, I was still chasing the pro hockey dream, right? It didn't work. But we were talking one night as a dating couple, and I was complaining to her. In hockey, your face gets cut up a lot. Could be stitches, could be glue. Cuts get sewn up or glued up. And I was complaining to her that I wish there was a product, I wish there was a technique that could close a cut on my face and leave it closed. And she looked at me and deadpan, serious face, looked me in the eye and said, "How about you stop getting punched in the face?" That's when I knew we were getting married. But think about it, lake management is the same thing, all right? Take an algae bloom, for example. How many times can you treat an algae bloom over and over and over again before you start saying, hey, maybe we should look into why this is happening? Instead of just trying to take care of a symptom, why don't we go for the cause? So, a monitoring slide, Scott covered this pretty well. Let me ask you this, how many of you have had surgery? All right, good number. So, if the surgeon, or more importantly, the anesthesiologist came in the room and said, hey, we're going to put you under, we'll see how it goes. We're not going to put you out. All right? No. Your vitals are getting taken hours before the surgery starts, all during the anesthesia, and how many hours afterwards? All right? Would you to agree to that situation? Being put under without your heart rate being checked, without your pulse being checked, without your oxygen saturation being checked? My son's a sports medicine major, sorry. So why would you do it for a lake? A lake is a living, breathing thing. So there's different methods of monitoring, obviously. There's physical, there's instrument-based, there's field, there's lab, there's clarity. Scott went through all these. But is it consistent? All right, field sampling procedures manuals, QAPs, standard methods, standard training protocols, standard operating procedures. These are the key. And again, Scott covered on these pretty good. This guy works harder than any intern I've ever had. So Scott covered C-SLAP. I'm not going to go through this. This is more of an introduction to C-SLAP for those who may not have it. So what I'm going to do now is go through a bunch of lake management techniques. We'll go through an overview. I'll give you a couple quick pluses and minuses of each, and then try to save questions for the end. All right? But I just want to cover the gamut a little bit in terms of everything. Submerged aquatic vegetation. There's harvesting, there's sterile grass carp, herbicides, hydroraking, benthic barriers, dredging, hand pull programs, and dyes. All right? This is just one topic. Harvesting, very simple. It's mowing the lawn. Right? It's fairly simple. It removes vegetation, usually from the top 2, 3, maybe 4 feet of the surface. A couple things you have to keep in mind. It can be slow moving. You have to dispose of all that vegetation. And you're not removing invasives. You could actually potentially spread them further. All right? But if your goal is to keep the top few feet clear, it's a good tool. Sterile grass carp. Very, very careful with this. Sterile grass carp, it's an effective tool. They have a preferred set of species for diet. They will obviously eat until, the cows come home. But more importantly, one of the things I recommend is be very, very cautious. You may get a permit to say, hey, you're allowed to do 15 per acre. I'd say do 5. It's a lot easier to put more in later than it is to try to get them out when it's too late. Herbicides, pretty straightforward. You have contact herbicides, you have systemic herbicides. New York has an interesting viewpoint with regard to herbicides. It's not necessarily an easy permit to get, which I agree with. But for select species, particularly invasives, herbicides can be a very easy, effective tool. I prefer systemic over contact. Slower, it's a slower rate for them to drop and decompose versus all at once with the contact. Hydroraking, particularly effective with your emergent species, spatterdock, lilies, etc. Very expensive, very slow moving. Maybe a quarter acre per day. All right. Obviously, there's permitting issues. In New Jersey, for example, Up until a couple of years ago, hydro raking didn't require a permit until someone from DEP went out to check out a site that was being hydro raked, and they saw more sediment on the shoreline than they did plants. That woke somebody up, and it's now a permitted activity. All right. But what this does is it removes vegetation from the roots, just literally rips it out. Spatterdock's a great example. That grows through tubers that are located under the sediment. If you don't get those tubers out, spatterdock is going to come back no matter what you do to it. Benthic barriers. Don't see a lot of these anymore. They were an old vegetation method of literally just covering the bottom so that nothing grows. It's somewhat inexpensive, logistically horrendous to try to move unless you've got the manpower and the divers, etc., etc. They also block out mussel habitat and benthic macroinvertebrate habitat. But they will keep something from growing if that's the main goal. Again, permits, etc. Dredging. You're not going to believe how many times you see dredging in this presentation. Fantastic tool if you've got the checkbook. All right. By the time you do permits, plans, design, but man, is it effective for so many things. Hand pulling programs. These are particularly well known in New York, especially in the Adirondack Park, although they've recently started to allow Priscilla permits up there. Hand pulling, very effective, however, long term. Expensive, manpower, slow moving, but effective because it gets the plant by the root system with little risk for fragmentation, especially with milfoil. Dyes. The theory with dyes is that it blocks out sunlight from reaching the bottom, which then allows plants to not grow. My own viewpoint, listen, don't dye the water unless it's a mini golf course. Right? That's just me, but it can be effective in very small water bodies. So going back to switching topics, halves, treating halves. Now this is the treatment on the spot. This is not going for the cause. Pesticides, oxidizers, and aeration, for example. Pesticides, very straightforward. Copper sulfate is one of the main cheap, easy, effective tools. Again, permit process in New York, but it's a relatively simple, easy, effective way to treat a hab. That being said, a good amount of the literature shows when treating with copper-based algicides, in 2 to 3 weeks, your hab will probably come back worse. Copper lyses the cell, gets rid of the algae, but then re-releases all the nutrients that were within the cell that it ate to begin with, along with the potential for cyanotoxins to be present. Thus, we really don't want to push copper too much. We'd rather you see you go for the source. Oxidizers. These are, again, they're an algicide, but they're hydrogen peroxide based. All right, they're probably about 5 to 6 times more expensive than a copper product would be. They're incredibly dangerous to handle. They're in that 20 to 30% hydrogen peroxide rate. And I'll give you an example. In 1990, the laboratory I was working in exploded. I was in the middle of it. I was flown to a trauma unit. I was covered in probably 75% sulfuric acid. After they cut my clothes off me, they flushed me, they worked on my eyes for 6 hours. I got everything back, no problem. The doctors told me if it had been hydrogen peroxide, you wouldn't have eyes left to even treat. Right? Because the bases are that much more dangerous for mucous membranes than acids are. Right? So the cost to treat with oxidizers reflects that. That being said, we actually prefer oxidizers for algae blooms because the oxidizer itself, if cyanotoxins are present, the oxidizer can treat the toxins and help to blow them off. Right? The problem is you don't know if the toxins are present without doing lab testing. Aeration. Aeration is a great tool if done correctly. If. Right? If it's done wrong, if the aeration system is undersized, If it's installed in the wrong areas, it can actually make your hab worse because it's pushing phosphorus-rich water from the anoxic bottom waters to the surface where the algae and sun are. All right? So it's very important that the aeration system is designed and installed according to your individual lake. It is not one size fits all. And how do you do that? With all your monitoring data that we were talking about and Scott talked about. Getting into aeration itself. Typical aeration is diffusers blowing air from the bottom to the top. And what your goal is to allow the water body to not stratify and be consistent top to bottom with temperature and for the most part DO. Thus, you don't get anoxy at the bottom, phosphorus doesn't come out of the sediment, which then feeds the algae at the top during the next windstorm or thunderstorm when the lake might turn over. All right. Typically in shallower, smaller water bodies, although I have seen it go in water bodies up to about 1,000 acres. Something relatively new, oxygen saturation technology. This is when you are pumping oxygen into the lower depths of the lake without the goal of breaking down the stratification. So you're still going to have stratification, but in that colder, deeper water, it's going to be oxygen rich, thus preventing internal loading of phosphorus from the sediment. All right, it is relatively new. A lot of the states I'm working in don't really know how to handle this yet in terms of permitting because it's not widely known. One of the benefits of this is this lake, for example. This is a 500-acre lake in North Jersey. You can see the line of bubbles right here. That's the oxygen. The key here is during the summer, this is a very round, deep lake. It's about 50 feet, 500 acres. But during the heat of the summer, there's only about a 2 to 3 meter level in the lake that would qualify for trout habitat, both in oxygen and temperature, right? So the key here is the bottom is being oxygenated, but you're not breaking the stratification, which would then ruin that trout habitat layer, right? So that's where all the different regulatory agencies are getting involved, going, not really sure how to do this. But cost. This system, $1.2 million. Needless to say, I saw a copy of the letter that went out to all the members of the association, what was going to happen to their dues. Nanobubbles. These are, again, another form of aeration. The theory is they are smaller bubbles. It's greater surface area. They tend to hang in the water column a little longer than a typical aeration. I can't really say I'm sold on them, to be honest. I've seen some situations where they work well. I've seen some situations where they were minimal at best. So now getting into that cause discussion we were talking about, nutrient inactivation. Right? As Scott was saying, if their phosphorus is high, there's a pretty good indication you're going to have algae issues. Right? And these are some methods of breaking down that phosphorus, getting it back to layers and lower levels that you can effectively manage. Alum, floating wetland islands, biochar, dredging, lanthanum clay. Alum is very straightforward. It's liquid alum or a form of liquid alum. Maybe it's buffered, maybe it's not. First alum treatment was done in 1968 in Sweden. Okay. I love reading articles where I read the sentence, new technology, alum. It's been around longer than me. It's very effective, it's relatively cheap, it is temporary, right? You're only going for X amount of years of control based on all your data, based on sediment data, based on water data. Cost is manageable. Toxicity issues based on pH, right? During an alum treatment, if the pH drops below a certain point, the alum can actually become toxic. Right? So that's why it has to be done carefully and with monitoring, which is all part of the permit process.
It's not allowed in New York yet.
No, my understanding is it's still considered a pesticide in New York. Floating wetland islands. All right, wetlands are perhaps one of the best phosphorus sinks you can possibly have in your watershed. All right. A lot of times, wetlands may not exist. They may have been filled in over time through development, etc. Floating wetland islands are a tool that you can put into the lake, which is literally a floating island filled with wetland plants where the root systems come down through the island and help to absorb phosphorus from the water column. I should have put it in here, I didn't. There is scientific literature showing how much phosphorus they remove based on how much time. They are a little expensive for what they actually look like. That being said, once you put them in, as long as the first year goes well in terms of keeping geese off them, etc. Guess I hit a nerve. See, in Colorado, we have a thing for geese. It's called mountain lions. Once you get that first year of growth established, they're pretty much maintenance free. And they have about a 10 to 12 year shelf life on the island before it gets a little too waterlogged. You can leave them in over the winter. This was actually developed in the wastewater industry in Montana. I think their winters are a little different than the Northeast. But they are relatively maintenance free. Place them. We have more problems with the rope breaking for anchors than we do with the islands themselves. Right? But they're a great tool, great tool. Biochar. Biochar is something relatively new in the industry. It's actually, for lack of a better term, it's charcoal. It's carbon-based tree material. It's very effective at removing phosphorus and nitrogen from water, right, among other things. AJ's going to get into that a bit later. We have found that it works better in standing water than it does flowing water because your contact time is more. Right now, I don't think it's a non-permitted activity in New York. In New Jersey, right now, you can go to town with this. Pennsylvania, you can go to town with this. There are grants being handed out left and right for biochar. Biochar started, and I'm familiar with this, biochar started in the West after, unfortunately, what was a terrible wildfire. Somebody looked at all those charcoal trees and went, I wonder if we can do something with that. And the process started from there. It's very, very effective at phosphorus and nitrogen removal. We've used them in water bodies, we've used them in streams, we've used them in stormwater outfalls. So stormwater is going through biochar prior to entering the lake.
What's the cost?
Those are 3-foot sleeves. They're about, I guess, 8-10 inches around. They're about $6 a sleeve. It depends on what situation it's in. In standing water, we've seen anywhere from 3 to 6 months. It depends how high your concentration of nutrient is. All right, but one of the things I like about biochar is you will get an indicator of when it's it's like a sponge. It'll absorb, and eventually it just starts to push off because it's full. There are indicators as to when it's full. You'll start to get growth on it, whether it's algae growth, moss growth, etc. That's how you know it's time to swap it out. We have many clients that use biochar, and we've trained their maintenance departments in just how to swap it out. Can we hold off on questions till the end? I got instructed to say that, I'm sorry. Dredging. Again, super effective. If you can get rid of all that nutrient-rich sediment, boy, that does wonders for your internal floating. And lanthanum clay, Utrosorb and Phoslock are probably the 2 products you've heard most. This is based on alum technology, but it uses lanthanum clay instead of alum, which is inert. You don't have toxicity issues. Right? You get longer control with lanthanum clay than what you do with alum. And it binds the phosphorus, making it unavailable for algae. The key is it does not bind all phosphorus. It binds certain forms of phosphorus. But it also works on the sediment as well to help with internal loading issues. So sediment management. This is pretty straightforward. Dredging, again, dig it up, get it out. Easier said than done. Lots of logistics, lots of money, lots of permits, et cetera, et cetera. I have a dredging project going right now. I just stopped in on it on Wednesday. 46,000 cubic yards being removed from a flood control leak. All right. For perspective, one dump truck is about 15 cubic yards. Bacteria. This is one of my favorites. If I put a quote in here, muck remover pellets are high concentration beneficial bacteria with 5 species of bacteria designed to eat 2 inches of muck per month. If you get a guarantee, run. I'm just going to say it. Run. All right. Here's the key, and here's what's not on here. The muck they're talking about is organic in nature. Right? Detritus, decaying plants, decaying algae, branches, leaves, etc. Right? It may help to break that down over time. Typically, the oxygen levels have to be screamingly high for that to happen. Right? Artificially so in times. I have yet to see a project or a paper where one of these muck removing projects actually has beneficial return. Right? And if any of you are familiar with Dr. Ken Wagner, he's up in Massachusetts, this is like his personal mission, to show that, I've seen his papers, I've seen his experiments, etc. I haven't seen anything effective yet that hydroraking and/or dredging couldn't do faster. More expensive, obviously, but actually effective versus crossing your fingers and hoping. Invasive species control. So in lakes, you have invasive species. They could be physical, they could be plants, they could be fish, they could be bugs, they could be zooplankton. So biomanipulation is a technique. It's a long-term technique. In this particular lake, in the 50s, they stocked alewife, right? Well, what ended up happening was over the years, the alewife got bigger and bigger and bigger. Alewife eats zooplankton. All of a sudden, they started having algae problems. No, that's because their zooplankton was basically wiped out. So in a long-term project, they stocked these hybrid striped bass, right? Voracious predators, but they do not replicate, right? They're sterile. They're hybrid striped bass. To knock the alewife down and get that food chain back in balance. That's biomanipulation. But again, just like the sterile grass carp, boy, you got to be careful when you mess with Mother Nature. All right. There's typical SAV management techniques we were talking about before. There's herbicides, there's hand pulling, etc., etc. Water chestnut obviously is big in this lower Hudson Valley area. Dredging. So when all these invasive species, particularly water chestnut, drop their seeds, where's it go? In the sediment. If you can get rid of the sediment, right? Easier said than done. Obviously, costs, permits, etc. So I'm going to give you a quick example of something. And we were talking about monitoring before and using data and collecting data. All right. This was Tibbetts Brook Park. It's in Yonkers, Westchester County. It's about 100 years old, the park itself. It's about 160 acres. The lake is only about 13 acres. Walking, hiking, fishing, birding. They got a DEC grant funding in 2019 through the Invasive Species Program to do a lake and watershed management plan. They wanted to dredge. The DEC said, well, okay, show me your management plan. They didn't have one. So they said, we'll give you the money for a plan instead. Because they need to figure out, they couldn't just dredge and then, hey, in 5 years it's going to fill back up again. We want to see a plan. We want to know these things. Right? And the DEC's right. They're not going to hand out a couple $1 million to clear out a lake when it could fill right back up in 3 years. So we did the plan. These are just some of the statistics that come from it. But you can see the sediment volumes here. 18,000 and 50,000 in the 2 water bodies. So you're talking almost 70,000 cubic yards. They needed a plan. So we did a phosphorus budget for them. This is the breakdown of where the phosphorus was coming from. A good chunk of it was watershed, as you would expect in an urbanized, developed area. All right, but there was one, this is the watershed, right? So pretty straightforward for the lower Hudson Valley, very urban, developed area. What they weren't thinking of was the internal load. All right, so the watershed was 68%, but the internal load from the sediment was 14%, but even higher than the sediment internal load, carp bioturbation. Because their carp population was so high, the carp contributed more phosphorus than the natural process, right? And bioturbation means carp, if you're familiar with carp, they suck in sediment, they filter out the food, and they spit it back out again. All that sediment disturbance just kept sediment in the water column, which kept it as a phosphorus source. So this is what carp removal looks like. Jesse's very passionate about carp removal. Jesse's also a Paul Smith graduate. But that's the lake. That's all water chestnut. So now you know that why they wanted to dredge, because they're so far beyond control at this point. Dredging would be the only longer-term control. They have been hydro raking since then. The park is actually overseen by the Westchester Parks Foundation, which is a nonprofit, so the county doesn't necessarily contribute like it would in a normal line item in a budget. So they put their plan into motion. Water chestnut management was at the top of the plan. Dredging, which now that they have their lake and watershed management plan, they can get an idea of how to help control the watershed-based sources as well. Organized carp removal, possibly aeration longer down the road, floating wetland islands, some joint projects with the city, specifically to address stormwater, continued monitoring. Again, you're not going to do something if you don't want to keep track of it to know that it's working. Right. So the water chestnut management, they've been doing bit by bit over the last few years with hydro raking. Again, it's a very slow moving operation, can be expensive, $2,000 to $3,000 a day. Luckily here, because they're partnered with the county, they have disposal locations where it's compost and mulch and that kind of a thing. So these were some of the other recipients of that grant, that same grant program. Look how many of them came up with lake and watershed management plans. Right? So why is everybody doing a plan versus doing an actual action? All right. So real quick, this is the current water quality improvement program. This is the grant program. It is open. It hasn't been open almost since that previous project. It is currently open. They are accepting applications right now. All right. But why does everybody do a plan? Tell me I didn't put it in the thing. I didn't. Damn. Well, now I know when the battery died on the plane on the way here. I'll go back to this. All right, never mind. Why does everybody do a plan? Because once you have that plan, the next time the grant program opens, whether it's state or federal, you can hold up your plan and say, I've got a plan, I've got recommended projects, I want to apply for a grant. Assuming you're not a private lake association. If you're private, you may have to partner with your town or county. Because a lot of times grants have to be given to municipal entities. But if you don't have a plan, you don't even have a starting point, right? Unless the town or the county or some other similar government-based municipal partner does. All right. These are some other sources. I was actually part of a contingent a couple weeks ago. We were down on Capitol Hill trying to push more funding to the 314 program, which hasn't been funded since the mid-90s, but that's not close. I won't get too deep into that. But if you don't have your plan, you don't have your starting point. Right? And your plan comes from where? Monitoring. All that CSLAP data, all your privately collected data. At some point, when you do your analysis, you have to figure out, do we have a problem, do we don't? If we do, what is it, and how do we solve it? And that starts the chain of events leading to a plan. All right, these are some other sources you can go to with regards to lake information, etc. Good?
A couple of questions.
Couple of questions.
Okay, and Tom's got the portable mic, so we can do that. Just.
Thanks for the great talk. Could you comment on hypothermic withdrawal as a way to reduce phosphorus?
Yeah, you know what's funny? I was gonna put that in here. That tends to be more of the water utilities, bigger, deeper reservoirs. Hypothermic withdrawal is that when your lakes or reservoirs are stratified, and that bottom water, that cold, dark, phosphorus-rich bottom water gets let go, right, from like a low-level outlet, for example. So you're actually physically removing that water. A lot of private lake associations don't necessarily have that infrastructure in place. It's more common with water utility reservoirs, with larger dams, and have the infrastructure to be able to do that. It's a great way to get rid of it. It might become somebody else's problem, but you can actually, yeah, it's an effective lake management tool. It's not really used at the private level too much. In the back? Oh, over here.
Just a question about the biochar bags that you guys were talking about before. Once you absorb all that stuff, is that considered hazardous waste? How do you get rid of the bags?
So that's a very good question. Depending on your manufacturer, some manufacturers will actually take it back and they can refurnace it, right? And the theory is everything burns off. It can be disposed of in typical landfill. There's actually some different programs going on now. We're actually working with Army Corps on this now. The problem is, and I was talking with AJ a tiny bit earlier, it's charcoal, right? And the laboratories, they're trying to test it, right? Normally what you have to do, you have to go through a huge QA/QC process in the labs. All right, well, you do something called a spike, for example, where you add a known amount of a contaminant to the matrix, and you should see that on the other end. The problem is it's charcoal, so it's absorbing the contaminant, and they're not seeing it on the other end. All right, so the testing for it has been a little wonky up to this point, which is why the manufacturers are saying, give it back to us. Just give it back to us. We'll incinerate it again. It's a pressure situation when they incinerate it. It has been a little bit of a hot topic with regard to disposal. There was a thought you could use it in gardens, you could use it as mulch, you could use it in landscaping. But we haven't gotten to enough data at that point yet to say, hey, yeah, this stuff is great at grabbing contaminants, but do they leach back out? Right? And we've got some projects going where that's going to happen in the fall, but there's not a lot of great data out there. So at this point, what we tell our clients is either give it back to the manufacturer or landfill, which it is permitted for.
Mike, I have the mic, sorry. You've referred to phosphorus many times. I don't know what causes the high levels of phosphorus that then cause the HABs. Can you explain that?
How long you got?
Give me the short answer.
The short answer, as Scott was saying, Adirondack lakes, for example, typically have less phosphorus levels. Why? There's not human development around them. All right? Human development definitely exacerbates phosphorus. 9 times out of 10 with a lot of our phosphorus budgets for lakes, it's lake communities, right, and septic influence. All right. It's unfortunate, but the pattern in Northeast PA, Northern New Jersey, Southern New York, even Northern New York, you're talking about places where there used to be weekend or seasonal cottages that are now year-round in many cases, but have the septic systems changed to meet year-round demand. All right? 2 weeks ago, I watched video of a septic system being pulled out at a lake community in northwest New Jersey. You know what the system was? A 55-gallon drum with a bunch of holes in it. right? That was 2 weeks ago. Go ahead.
Just what about goose species? Does that add to phosphorus?
Say that again, I'm sorry.
Geese.
Oh, yeah, 4 geese can defecate enough in one day to equal a 3-bedroom septic system.
So please join me in thanking Chris. So we're going to go to a break, and Chris will be around. I mean, again, this was a great talk and an overview of a lot of stuff. So, okay, so we'll go to break. We'll call you back at about 11:15. Yes, and, but Chris, I think, is also staying for lunch, and will be also, so at break or at lunch. So thank you. Special person for NYSPOA, and that is our relatively new executive director, Dave Carr, and he will take a few minutes just to tell you a little bit about what's going on with NYSPOA. So welcome, Dave.
Thank you, everybody. It's great to be here. This is a fantastic piece. The regional conferences are getting better and better, and more and more people. It's fantastic. So, and nice job on this location. Amazing. Okay, this is going to be Cliff Notes version of NYSPOA. We're going to run through it really fast. We're established. That's okay. That's all right. No worries. Okay, so started in 1983, so that makes us 41 years old. Did I break it? Oh man, okay, that's embarrassing. Okay. Hey, look at that. Okay. Whoop. Here we are. Okay, our mission. Basically, we're here to support and help virtually anybody around the state to protect our water resources. Now, we're centric, focused on lake associations, obviously, but this is where we're at, and it's important for us to do this. And I'm going to mention this mission a little bit later, so memorize it carefully. It's okay, I'll get it. NYSPOA, we're a 501c3, not-for-profit. That's an old map we'll update, but there's an example of members all across the state. We have 240-ish members at this point. Memberships are lake associations, individuals, corporate partners, and so on. So that's a real quick overview of NYSPOA. So, who am I? What am I doing here? Who am I? Okay. I'm a state New York native. I'll just stay right there. I've lived in Auburn in the Finger Lakes region for about 20 some odd years now. Most of my education experience has been in environmental sciences, water resources primarily. I got my master's in environmental science and forestry in Syracuse shortly after electricity was invented. My first career was in geospatial technologies, geographic information systems, and those kinds of things. Focused mostly on watershed mapping, water resources mapping, and analyzing problems. More fast forward now, I work for the Wasco Watershed Lake Association in Finger Lakes for about 6 years, doing administration and program support for them. While I was there, I also worked for part of the time at the Finger Lakes Institute, Hobart William Smith Colleges in Geneva. I was working on the Starry Stonework Collaborative for the Great Lakes Basin. Starry Stonework, if you don't know, is an invasive macroalgae, and I hope you don't have it in your lakes. And then in October, I guess that's 9-ish months, I came on as executive director. There's going to be a quiz on this. No, just kidding. These are our board of directors. Jan, Laurel, Ina, all here. They're all on our board. They do wonderful things for us. We're very happy. Everybody on this board are all in committees, and they work real hard and very active and help us keep NYSPOA moving. So it's a great group of people. They're all great to work with. C-SLAP. We've already heard all about C-SLAP several times, and Elena's next, and she's going to give you a lot more information on it. I will mention that where it says my Spola is responsible for day-to-day, really that's Nancy Muller. Okay, she's in her office. She held the executive director position and C-SLAP coordinator position for, I don't know, 20 plus years or something. So I came on and she can just focus on C-SLAP full time now. Does a great job. She works with Elena very closely. They talk often and work things out. At the bottom there, this year we have, those numbers might be off a few. I didn't quite, I don't know if you know the right numbers, Elena, but we got 196 sites on 183 lakes across the state. So all of you in C-SLAP, thank you. This is fantastic. Keep the work going. It's such an important program. All right, so what else are we doing? I came on and, the board made a big decision to bring on executive director and C-SLAP run, focus on that between two people. So what are we doing? Where are we going with it? Well, we're just getting started figuring that out. We've had a few meetings and so on. We are gathering and assembling information. All right? We're asking for thoughts and ideas at the annual conference early May. We had big flip charts with basic questions on them, and people could write their thoughts and ideas and responses on sticky notes. We're bringing all that stuff together, getting organized with that. We're having one-on-one meetings at the regional level. Here we are. I'm also talking with people individually, both at the Lake Association level, but also kind of click above, because there's an awful lot of you across the state who want to meet. So I'm talking to regional folks, soil and water conservation districts, of a wide variety of people, just to get that feeling what's going on. If there's any thoughts you have, we're accepting all kinds of information. If you have any thoughts about NYSFOLA, what more it could be doing, what's different it could be doing, let us know. You can go to our website. I have a few business cards. You can contact me directly, whatever you want to do. Survey at the bottom there. All this information is helping us form and fine-tune what will be a formal survey as a major part of the strategic planning effort. So look for that. We have a committee of 6 of us. Hands on the committee. 6 of us, I guess. And we may probably hire a facilitator, a professional facilitator to help streamline the process, get us through it efficiently, and so on. We're still working on that. We're going to meet with one of them soon, I think, at our next meeting. And review and evaluate at all levels. What I mean by that is we're going to start at the top. The mission, or I told you, remember the mission, you've all got it memorized. We're going to look at that, start there, look at that, and then move down, hopefully come up with 5 or 6 areas of focus that'll be the major programs and areas of concern we'll have, break those down into subsections, and then keep going finer and finer and get the work done. Not here to try and change things. I don't want to just change things for no reason. So if it ain't broke, don't fix it kind of thing. But we are going to look at everything and decide where we want to go, what programs we're going to do, what more can NYSFOLA do than it is now. There's C-SLAP is a huge part of what we do, but there's more that we can do beyond C-SLAP. So we're trying to figure out what our best focus is moving forward. So please let me know your thoughts. And that's our website, nysfola.org. This is going to get revised too at some time in the, I hope, relative near future. But it's there's a lot of information on there. There's a contact page. You can send a note in on that if you want. And that's all I got.
Thank you.
So again, I really thank Dave for coming and giving us all a view of not only where NYSFOLA is, but where we hope to go, or the fact that we are trying to figure out where to go. So, and I think I've done an effective battery-ectomy on this, so I hope that will work. I'm sorry about that, Dave. Okay, so it's my great pleasure to introduce Elena Onion. Oops. Okay, looking to see, I guess the charts are ready. So Elena has been relatively recently, moved into the part of nice NYSDEC that really works most closely with NYSVOLA and with the lake associations, and it's really been a pleasure to get to know her. I'm also on the CSLAP committee, so have the